Hello, you're watching the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. Coming up on today's programme. Charging points for electric vehicles in all new homes from next year. But are measures like this enough to tackle the climate crisis? The chief executive of Qatar 2022 tells Sky News the World Cup will be the greenest yet. And we meet the woman behind an environmental organisation on a mission to stop plastic pollution. Hello and welcome to the UK's only daily climate news show where we track the changes happening to our world right now and challenge those coming up with the solutions. And one of those solutions is often hailed as electric vehicles, with the government announcing today that from next year, charging points for EVs will be legally required in all new build homes as part of efforts to help the UK reach net zero emissions by 2050. Here's what the Prime Minister had to say earlier.
We're regulating so as to require new homes and buildings to have EV charging points, with another 145,000 charging points to be installed thanks to these regulations. We're investing in new projects to turn wind power into hydrogen, and the net zero strategy is expected to trigger about £90 billion of private sector investment, driving the creation of high-wage, high-skilled jobs across the UK as part of our mission to unite and level up across the country.
Well, our climate correspondent Hannah Thomas-Peter joins me now. Hello to you, Hannah. Is this going to make a big difference, or is it just tinkering round the edges by the government?
Well, surface transport is one of the key sectors that the government knows it has to decarbonise almost entirely if it's going to hit its net zero targets. Cars and taxis constitute about 16% of all carbon emissions annually from the UK. And so electrification, as far as the government is concerned, is the answer. The criticism has been that infrastructure doesn't exist to support electric vehicles. Not on street charging posts and lamp posts and so on, and not on the edges of homes. And so those two problems need to be addressed. This is specifically targeted at individual homes. It's hoped that it will create some 145,000 extra charging points every year. So this will have an impact if it is rolled out as promised, but the criticisms continue in relation to the government's promises on electrifying our transport network, and that is that it's very hard to do this in a levelled way. That there are already charging black spots in small towns, for example, in areas where homes do not have driveways, and particularly in rural areas. So to make sure that everyone has equitable access to the electrical vehicle charging network, and the separate argument, of course, is all of the problems around the affordability of electric cars in the first place. The government has to change the law to change the structure of our lives so that we can electrify our lives, which is what they hope will decarbonise this hugely emitting sector.
Hannah, thank you. And we're going to be talking about this further in today's Climate Show debate with the economist Vicky Pryce and Donncha McCarthy, climate columnist at The Independent. That is coming up in a few minutes' time. Let's take a look at some of today's other climate news now. London has been named the most vegan-friendly and future-ready city in the world by Abillion, a tech company that aims to encourage sustainable living. Abillion assessed cities on how much they've embraced plant-based lifestyles, their commitment to green policies, greenhouse gas emissions and waste generation. London earned its top spot based on immense progress on emissions, transport, green spaces, air quality and clean energy. One of the biggest fossil fuel projects in Australia has been given final approval. That's despite being labelled a disaster by environmentalists. Production at the oil and gas field is set to start in 2026 and will have 30 wells drilled over its lifetime. The Scarborough project is a venture between energy giants Woodside and BHP, who've merged to create one of the world's biggest fossil fuel companies. And the Prince of Wales has met with the President of Israel at Highgrove. Isaac Herzog tweeted that he and Prince Charles discussed the climate crisis and potential for regional cooperation After the meeting, Israel's government recently announced actions to reach net zero by 2050, including rolling out green infrastructure and developing carbon capture and storage technology. It is just under a year to go until the 2022 World Cup kicks off in Qatar. And the tournament's boss has told Sky News he thinks it will be the greenest yet. Nasser Al Khater was speaking to our sports correspondent Tom Parmenter.
Each stadium has been built with legacy in mind, so every stadium has a purpose after the tournament. Some of them will be going to football clubs where they have really old facilities. A lot of these old football clubs are in highly dense residential areas. So when they get their new stadiums, it'll be the new home for their clubs. When we talk about the environment, one key thing was how do we improve environmental awareness and how do we improve the environmental sustainability of the country? The state has built or is building two solar power generation plants of 600 megawatts each. And I think that's a massive benefit of the World Cup as well.
So this will be probably the greenest tournament to date?
Yes, mainly, and one big factor is the compact nature of Qatar. The elimination of air travel from city to city for the teams, for fans and so forth, goes a long way to also decreasing the carbon footprint.
And Tom joins me now. Hello, Tom. It is a laudable aim. Is it as good as it sounds?
Well, they're trying to sell it as the first carbon-neutral World Cup, and there are quite a few levers that they are pulling as part of that, as you heard there. It will be one international flight for most people attending the World Cup into Doha, and then there'll be no domestic air travel because all the stadiums are within an hour of each other. And that is a big difference because perhaps in previous World Cups in Brazil and Russia, we've seen fans and teams travelling enormous distances, a lot of internal flights as part of the World Cup as they progress through the tournament, and that simply won't happen in Qatar. It's all very compact, and that is a big factor in reducing the footprint. But nevertheless, there will still be a big footprint because you've got lots of people flying into one place from all over the world, and 95% of the emissions will come from transportation of people arriving into Qatar from various continents, and also the construction and accommodation. So it is inevitably going to have a big footprint, but they want to try and offset that, and you cannot obviously offset it. But there are also other things to consider when you look at Qatar. This is the first Winter World Cup, so that is because it is simply too hot to play there during the heat of the summer. And also, you have to bear in mind that Qatar is one of the world's biggest natural gas and a major oil producer as well. And then there are the other considerations of human rights, a lot of spotlight on the conditions that workers have been in as they've constructed those stadiums, and of course equalities, because this is a country where homosexuality is against the law. The organisers say everyone is welcome, but I have to say the environmental sustainability of the tournament is probably at the fore now in the planning of this tournament, and probably is as high up the list of priorities as it's ever been.
Tom, you touched on the issue of flights. Whatever measures are taken in Qatar, can a big global sporting event like this ever truly be sustainable?
Well, they're doing their best, they say, and each World Cup we're seeing incremental progress on sustainability, but you can't have an empty tournament. You need people there to make it a tournament, to make it a World Cup, and therefore the offset process will be part of how they try to make it carbon neutral, but you can never reduce the footprint to nothing because you have this enormous gathering of people, this time in the desert. There will be some big benefits that come from it, a much cleaner transport system in Doha, for example, but the net gain, I suppose, is that each World Cup tries to improve on the last, and Qatar is trying to set new standards, and inevitably they are pushing the boundaries to try to underline their green credentials as they face the gaze of the world's media, as we're now 1 year to go, and that will only get bigger as we go through to next winter when this World Cup will kick off.
Yeah, the countdown is on. Tom, thank you very much indeed. Well, let's take a look at our data dashboard now and see where electricity in Great Britain is coming from. Right now, around 47% is coming from gas 5.5% coming from coal and 21.9% coming from renewable sources. If you've been outside, you'll know it's been a cold but a sunny day across many parts of the country today, and that has meant more power from solar, providing around 9% of the mix earlier on. That is compared to an average of around 1.4% for the rest of this month. Solar panels, in fact, perform better in cooler weather, so we do tend to see solar generation records in late April when Britain's more likely to experience strong sunshine and lower temperatures. Now, millions of tonnes of plastic waste ends up in our oceans around the world, and now campaigners are targeting some common household objects, wanting to change the way they're manufactured. In the latest in our series of Climate Diaries, we're meeting Natalie Fee, an award-winning environmentalist and founder of City to Sea.
I'm Natalie Fee and I'm the founder of City to Sea. We're a not-for-profit campaigning to stop plastic pollution at source. We tend to campaign on the top 10 most commonly found plastic items on our beaches, things like plastic bottles and bottle top caps, and we do that primarily through our refill campaign. A cheeky little refill. Woo! We also developed an app which is stopping hundreds of millions of pieces of plastic from entering the waste stream, connecting people to places they can refill their water bottle, they can refill their household goods, and coffee cups and things like that as well. I'm working towards a future in which plastic on beaches and plastic harming our marine animals becomes a thing of the past, and we have designed pointless plastic out of the waste system, and we are refilling our way to a truly circular economy.
Do stay with us, because coming up after the break, I'm going to be joined by the economist Vicky Pryce and the Independent's climate columnist Donica McCarthy. We're going to be discussing if policies like more electric vehicle charging points go far enough and whether climate protests could look different in the future. We'll see you in a couple of minutes. Hello, and welcome back to the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. And we're getting straight to discussing the climate issues of the day with the economist Vicky Pryce and Donica McCarthy, climate columnist at The Independent. Now, as we heard earlier, developers will have to install electric vehicle charging points at new homes, workplaces and supermarkets from next year. But with 25 million homes still heated by a gas boiler, many of them with poor insulation, should the government be doing more to accelerate the green transition? Vicky, Downing Street has today described this as a world-beating plan, is it?
Well, it's a very interesting idea to force builders to rethink the way in which they put together the houses, or when you're looking at perhaps, I think it's included too in what we heard today, restructuring a building or renovating or changing the use of a particular building, that you can actually now, or you have to be forced to add charging points too for electric vehicles. And it does make quite a lot of sense in my view. But of course, we're talking about new homes. Quite a lot of homes right now, as we know, don't have even driveways where they can park their cars. So it will require quite a lot of rethinking in terms of where those charging points really are put. And I think just putting them in the new homes isn't going to be the answer, what people need, given that we now have something like 10% of new cars being sold being electric. You need proper public charging points. You need to be able to get into a petrol station of sorts, if you like, and use it just like you're using it now for normal fuel, and be able to recharge your batteries quite easily and quickly, which is something that we're still a long, long way from being able to have got to really. It requires battery production to improve, battery technology to improve, and loads more charging points to be available across a large part of the UK, where at present there are big gaps. London and the South East is well provided by comparison. Quite a lot of the rest of the UK isn't.
Yeah, and the clock is ticking, isn't it? Because we know that new petrol and diesel cars are being phased out by 2030. There's no choice. The government's got to do something, Donncha. Does this plan go far and fast enough?
It's a tiny step in a direction for better facilities for EVs. But of course, what the government's totally ignoring is actually the need for us to be moving away from a car culture in our cities. 83% of the United Kingdom public live in towns and cities. And what we need to be doing there is investing in cycle lanes and public transport. And we've been going in the opposite direction on that. Public transport has, in real terms, had its prices increased above inflation every year for the last 10 years, whilst actually they've reduced the fossil fuel duties for cars. And our investment in cycle lane infrastructure is abysmal. It's around a tenth of what the United Nations says we need to be spending.
Vicky, we talked about gas boilers, we talked about home insulation. In the wider scheme of things, how big a deal is this?
Oh, it's not immense, I have to say. I think the most important thing of all is to think about this, public charging places that we absolutely need. But of course, the interesting thing is that when you're looking at how we might move around in the future, of course, I take the point that perhaps we need to be rethinking whether we use a car in cities as much as we do at present. We've also got a different element in terms of how we'll power our cars. Hydrogen is being developed now as the possibility of replacing petrol as the main fuel for cars. And if that's the case, then quite a lot of those electric charging points may in fact not be needed. So the balance between the two is going to be really quite important. So what the government, I think, is doing, which I think is reasonably clever, is saying that we're not going to be investing anything ourselves. We're having a law which is going to force those charging points to appear. So they're not actually spending anything particularly much on this. Whereas when it comes to really investing in hydrogen technology, the government is going to have to absolutely sit down with all the whole of the industry and participate and also share some of the risk of that. So this is a low risk strategy for them, but I think they're going to need to think a lot more widely than that.
Well, let's discuss our second topic now, because from shutting down cities to skipping school, protest action from groups like Extinction Rebellion and Fridays for Future have shone a spotlight on the climate crisis. Now, police could be given more powers to crack down on protests as part of a new policing bill put forward by the government. Under the new measures, officers could cancel demonstrations for being too noisy, as well as confiscating items like superglue to stop activists from attaching themselves to buildings and, of course, roads. Donncha, this comes about in the wake of the very high-profile protests by Insulate Britain. Do you think it's going to make a difference? Do you think it will be a deterrent?
I think the one area where the government is delivering on its promises on climate is on its promises to crack down on climate protests. It's really disturbing what direction they're moving in. They're beginning to equate peaceful protests with terrorism, introducing a law that puts people in jail for 10 years for being seriously annoying is something you would expect in communist China or Putin's Russia. And the new proposals that they're now beginning to use injunctions, which bypasses the human right to jury trial, is really disturbing. Putting people in front of a court that with an unlimited fine for peacefully protesting on a road is not something we should be accepting in a liberal democracy, and it's really disturbing. However, we have to acknowledge that every single human rights movement in the world in the last 100 years, governments have cracked down on it, people have gone to jail, and then the human rights have been established. The tragedy is how many young people in grief and despair at lack of action by the government will end up in jail to try and get the government to do what's needed.
And the judge who jailed 9 recent Insulate Britain protesters said that while weighing up the rights to protest, also weighing up the rights of individuals to go about their daily lives. Vicky, YouGov poll has found that 18% of people in the UK support the actions of Insulate Britain. They have certainly got their message across. They have certainly made their purpose known. So does that constitute a success?
I would imagine that it is. I mean, they have to watch what they do in the future, obviously, if these laws are indeed passed, and that's how they have to watch what they're doing in the future. But they have certainly made everyone much more aware of some of the issues. But people warm to that, if you like, if one can use that expression. But we do know that the costs are enormous, and they're enormous for individuals. And the question is what the government can do.
Vicky, I'm sorry to cut you off, but Vicky and Donica, we are out of time. Thank you very much indeed for that discussion today. That is everything from us this evening. On tomorrow's show, I'll be joined by The Guardian columnist George Monbiot and Julia King, Baroness Brown of Cambridge, to discuss all of the big climate stories of the day. But do stay tuned, because coming up next here on Sky News Tonight, we will have the latest from the police in Wisconsin after a car hit a Christmas parade in the state, leaving at least 5 people dead. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.